Right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today for the first installment of our Student Career Skills webinar series. Today, we are going to be talking about how to write and talk about your accomplishments in resumes, cover letters, and interviews. And I'm very excited to introduce our speaker for today, Dan Pooks. He is joining us from the University of Washington, and I will go ahead and kick it over to him.
Thanks, Adrian, and thank you again for pronouncing my name correctly. It's funny because I always thought that your last name was pronounced Gotard, like the French pronunciation, but you said it's Gothard. Is that right? Thanks for that. As Adrian said, my name is Dan Pooks. My pronouns are he and him, and I work at the University of Washington in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences, which is a department within our School of Public Health. And my job is really focused on managing experiential learning and providing career services to our undergraduate students and our graduate students. We have about 100 undergrads and about 90 grad students at this point. I worked at University of Washington for about 10 years. I spent some time working as an academic advisor, and then later I worked in the Career Center as a career coach, really specializing in helping students apply to and get into medical school and dental school and other health professional programs like that. And for about 2 years, I've been working with students within our department, helping them to find internships while they're students, and then help them find jobs after they graduate. If you're interested in getting a graduate degree, we have a number of really nice ones that you might want to consider, including a MS Applied program, which is only 15 months. It's 1 year. You do a summer internship, you come back for 1 quarter in the fall. And so for many people, that's all the graduate education that they need. And if you're interested in learning more, you can certainly click on that link in the slides that'll be sent out after today's presentation, I believe. As I mentioned earlier, we're also part of a larger School of Public Health, and there may be other degrees within our School of Public Health beyond just our department that you might be interested in as well. And you're welcome to make an appointment with my colleague, Amy, who's our graduate student advisor, to talk more about what kind of graduate program might be right for you. Okay, today's topic is very broad, but I think it's helpful to think more about some of the common themes, some of the through lines, the areas of overlap between the resume, the cover letter, and the interview. I see the resume and the cover letter being sort of two things that need to work together, need to complement each other to get you to the interview. But a lot of the same techniques that I encourage students to use when putting the resume together, when writing a compelling cover letter, are the same techniques that I encourage them to use when preparing for interviews. So it does make sense to try to cover all three of these topics today in the same workshop. But because there are such large topics, I'm going to go kind of quickly through each one of them, starting with the resume, then going on to cover letters, and then talking more about interviews. And I'll stop along the way if people have any questions. And if it's okay with you, just to kind of shrink my bandwidth a little bit, I'm going to turn off my camera while I'm talking, but I'll turn it back on during the Q&A sections as we go along. Okay. So if you think about these three things, the resume, the cover letter, and the interview, you could imagine three different versions of a story that you could tell. In your resume, each of your bullet points is really telling a really short story, maybe 1 or 2 lines, not even a complete sentence. But you take bullet points from your resume and grow them into paragraphs in your cover letter that tell a story in more detail. And those are typically 3 to 5 sentences. And then if the bullet point and the cover letter paragraph are doing their job and you are invited to an interview, then you have another opportunity to grow that cover letter paragraph into a response to a question in an interview, which is typically going to be somewhere between 90 and 120 seconds. But it's the same story. It's just 3 different versions of the same story. And if you think about telling your story in an effective way, you'll be able to make each of these things work harder for you. Starting with those bullet points I mentioned a minute ago, you want to make sure that they start with an action verb. I can forward you a link to a resource here. Let me stop sharing just for one moment. I made a list of links that I wanted to make sure I pasted into the chat. And I'll do that here, and I'll start sharing again in just one moment. Here we go. Okay. So I put links to the resources which I'm going to be referring to here. and you're welcome to click on those and download them. And of course, I'll try to make those available to you later on as well. This is a great resource from our Career Center here at UW. It's almost like a thesaurus dictionary of action verbs. And so if you're struggling because you feel like you're using the same action verbs over and over again in your resume, this will help you freshen things up a bit. But it's always great to start with a strong action verb. And you can also make these bullet points work harder by adding more descriptive language, which could include things like adverbs, like quickly or accurately or cheaply or efficiently. Words that tell them more about not just how you did that one thing, but how you do all the things that you do. It's always great if you can quantify the impact of your work in a bullet point, but not everything is quantifiable. So using adjectives can help you qualify the impact of your work. And by adjectives, I mean describing the products that you might have made or describing the kinds of people that you worked with. Along the way, you really want to focus on highlighting skills, strengths, accomplishments. What did you really learn? That's going to be a recurring theme between the resume, the cover letter, and the interview, is that they're really interested more, employers are interested more in what you've learned from what you've done than what you've actually done. And so your job is to really spotlight that learning while talking about what you did. The kinds of experiences that you can talk about in a bullet point, in a paragraph, in a cover letter, and in an interview can include all of these things, paid and unpaid. Sometimes students think that employers are more interested in things they got paid for than things they didn't get paid for. And I don't think that's the case. I think things that we do in our volunteering time sometimes say even more about us than the things that we get paid for. So you should feel comfortable talking about all of these things in your resume, in a cover letter, and in an interview. You'll, of course, want to provide some context for whoever you're talking to, whether it's about your Greek life experience or your church group or a campaign that you might have been involved in case they're not already familiar with that. Employers also love it when people talk about their projects in their resume. These could include solo projects that you did in class or as part of a group. They could be things you worked on independently or as part of a involvement with a club, like a hackathon or a case competition. These are all things that say a lot about you as a prospective employee. And so you should certainly feel comfortable talking about them in your resume, in a cover letter, and in the interview. Here are a couple of helpful formulas for putting together a bullet point. And as I said earlier, it's really about talking about what you did, but putting it in the context of what it says about what you're good at. So accomplished blank, using my skills in blank and blank, is a great way to talk about an accomplishment that you had, whether you can quantify it or qualify it, while at the same time really explaining to the employer what skills you brought that made it such a success. So, an example, maybe something like an event that you helped to plan for a club that you were involved in. Maybe it was a fundraiser or a friend raiser. You could talk about what you accomplished as part of the event, comma, using my skills in event planning and fundraising, something like that. And ideally, the words that are in those two blanks at the end are going to be coming directly out of the job description or the internship description that you're applying for. Another example is really, again, talking about those skills, maybe not skills that you had already, but skills that you gained or skills that you built along the way while doing a particular activity. So this helps that bullet point work harder for you by really focusing more on what you learned. So that's just a little bit about resumes. Does anybody have any burning questions about resumes that you wanted to talk about before we move on to cover letters? Let me check the chat. Oh, thank you, Adrian. Okay, so as I said before, our unit of measure when doing resumes is the bullet point. 1 or 2 lines, doesn't even have a subject, doesn't even have a period at the end. But the next level is going to be the cover letter. So let's talk a little bit more about cover letters. And one of the other links I provided in the chat is to this 2-page handout from the UW Career Center on getting started with cover letters. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but I do want you to think about a formula for a cover letter. And since it's around lunchtime, the formula that I like to use when talking about cover letters is a sandwich. So you can see that the opening paragraph is sort of like the top bread or the top bun. It has a very important job to do, which is to really show your interest, your excitement, and your enthusiasm for this particular opportunity. And that the information that you include here really needs to be so nuanced and so detailed that you really couldn't say it about another opportunity. which is why generic cover letters really don't work very well, and I don't recommend students use them. The body paragraphs are kind of like the inside of the sandwich, the fillings, the top, the condiments. And you might have two slightly longer paragraphs that are maybe like 5 sentences, or you might have three slightly shorter paragraphs that are closer to 3 sentences each. But you don't have a lot of room here. You can't tell a lot of stories. So you have to pick the best stories from your resume that demonstrate the kinds of skills they're looking for in this particular position. And you might reuse those stories from one cover letter to another, but it's really important to take a moment to customize them. And I think all you really have to do oftentimes is just put one sentence at the very end of the paragraph, like I have done here at the bottom. This story shows I'm good at blank, which is a qualification, whether it's a required qualification or a desired qualification that comes right out of the job description, comma, which will be important when I have to. And here's where you insert one of the responsibilities or one of the tasks or one of the activities that is going to be associated with this job. So you're really just making connections between what you did and how that's going to help you be successful in doing what it is that they need you to do. A variation on this is to focus on a value. Maybe you got good at something as part of this activity, or maybe it helped clarify that something is really important to you in your future work. And that could be the takeaway from the story, which again is how you connect back to something about the organization that you're so excited about. That's really important in the cover letter. That's what employers are looking for in great cover letters. That's really the difference between a good cover letter and a great one. And that's going to help get you to the interview, which is really the job of the cover letter. You see here that in that handout, they talk about the STAR method. We're going to talk more about techniques for storytelling when we get to the interview stage, but it's absolutely important here at the cover letter stage that your stories are crisp and concise, and they don't just talk about what you did, but why you did it, and also what were the results of whatever it was that you did. That's going to ensure that the story has a good beginning, a good middle, and a good end. The end of the cover letter, that last paragraph, the bottom bun or the bottom bread, should reiterate that interest and enthusiasm about the position, about the organization. And it can be very forward-looking. You can talk more about the future. One thing that you should definitely include in that last paragraph is the word interview. You want to ask for the interview. You don't just want to say something like, I look forward to hearing from you soon, or, I'm available whenever. You want to ask for the interview, and you want to thank them for their consideration. But that's really going to help ensure that that cover letter is working as hard for you as it needs to. Okay. I know I'm going kind of quickly through here, and I'm going to leave plenty of time at the end for any additional questions. Does anybody have any questions about cover letters? Okay, I'm just going to keep on trucking. All right. So we've gotten to the interview stage. Your resume did its job, the cover letter did its job, and now they've asked you to come in for an interview. Congratulations, first of all, because that's a big deal. Just getting to an interview stage is a big deal, and it's something that you should celebrate about yourself every time you get an interview, because it's a big deal. Not everybody gets an interview. Not everybody even gets a callback. So it's a significant accomplishment just to make it to this stage of the process. It is a different stage. Interviews serve a different purpose, both to the employer and to you. And if there's one takeaway I want you to take away from this particular part of the workshop, is that you need to feel a sense of agency going into the interview. You want to feel comfortable and confident as much as possible in this idea that you are also interviewing them. And you may feel desperate, and you may feel like you can't afford to be choosy, and you may feel like there's never going to be another opportunity. But trust me when I say that those states of mind aren't going to help you shine during the interview. So as much as possible, try to focus on those things at the bottom. Is this job going to really help me use my strengths and interests? Is it going to offer me the opportunity to develop and grow in whatever way I want to grow? And is the work environment going to be one where I can bring as much of myself or all of myself to work if I want to? And that's just as important as the actual work that you're doing. So you can see how, from the employer's perspective, it's very different sometimes than from the candidate's perspective. They're wanting to make sure you've got the skills, but honestly, if they had concerns about your skills, they probably wouldn't be interviewing you at all. And then I don't really like to use the word fit in the work I do with students a lot because it has a lot of baggage and it feels like sometimes it can convey this notion that everybody has to be exactly the same. And I don't think that's what employers are looking for at all. But the way I do encourage students to think about fit is, are your values aligned with theirs? And you'll see a number of ways to determine that in the interview, questions that you're going to come up here in a minute. And also, how can you contribute in unique ways? And by that, I mean in ways that other applicants cannot. And so that's a useful thing to also be thinking about as you prepare for an interview. Again, it's really about showing enthusiasm and excitement for the particular opportunity and probably a demonstrated, nuanced understanding of their unique organizational culture, which is very hard to determine from the outside looking in. Here are a couple of things to think about depending on the medium of the interview. Phone interviews, honestly, I feel like phone interviews are the worst kind of interviews because not only do you not have any ability to convey enthusiasm and excitement through your body language, all you have to rely on is your voice and the words that you use, but you're also not getting any feedback from the people you're talking to. So you really have no idea how what you're saying is landing on them. And that can also be kind of nerve-wracking. You obviously have to make your voice do all the work in this situation, which means modulating your tone, talking faster, and then talking slower, using long dramatic pauses at times. These kinds of things help make your voice more interesting to listen to, just like on a good podcast. And then it does help to say words like enthusiastic or excited or eager. Any of those words that start with E, it helps to say them aloud. All of those things are true in a virtual interview too, because while you do have the ability to have a camera on, it's a very narrow window into your body language, which is why I think with virtual interviews, it's especially important to really make sure that you're having good eye contact, which usually in a virtual interview means you're actually looking at the camera, which makes it look like you're having good eye contact. And for many people, it's kind of nerve-wracking to look into a camera. If it's an in-person interview, you have another series of things you want to be thinking about. Let's start with the way that you're dressed. You want to demonstrate a good understanding of the organizational culture in an interview setting. You also want to avoid distractions when it comes to things like jewelry, cologne or perfume, as well as any kind of body language that might be distracting from the kinds of answers that you're providing to questions. So those are some additional things you need to think about if it's an in-person interview. You also may, in the future, encounter an asynchronous interview platform because these things are very efficient for employers, and so more employers are moving to using them. This is where you record yourself answering questions, and then they watch it at some point later. And again, there's nobody there, which for people who aren't used to recording themselves can also be unnerving. I think the big takeaway here is you want to make sure that you familiarize yourself as much as possible with the platform that they're using and be thoughtful about time. How much time do you have to record yourself? How much time do you have before you have to start recording yourself? Can you redo an answer if you want to? How many questions are there going to be, etc. So this really, again, depends on the medium that you are interviewing. But overall, I think regardless of the interview format, the way I encourage students to prepare for interviews is really to be very thoughtful and strategic about what you want to have said at the end of the interview when it's all over. Because you really can't predict what questions they're going to ask you, although we're going to try to do a little bit of that today, but you really can't predict what they're going to ask. So think about what you want to say about you. What makes you different? What makes you special? What makes you unique? What makes you weird? Maybe 3 to 5 things. And then it's also really important because, as I said earlier, the interview is about excitement and enthusiasm and demonstrating a unique understanding of their organizational culture. You want to think about 3 to 5 things that you want to say about them, things that you know about them already from your research that you're excited about. And you want to be very thoughtful and intentional about mentioning those things throughout the interview, as well as the things about yourself. Because they might come right out and ask you, why do you want to work here? But they might not, because that might be something that they're looking for in your responses to every question. So that's why you want to be very strategic about this. I encourage students to think about this like a card game. So at this point, you've got 6 to 10 cards, 3 to 5 about you, 3 to 5 about them. And then you're looking to play your cards during the interview in response to various questions that they ask, such that by the end of the interview, you've played all of your cards. So it's a game, and that can sometimes take things that are scary and make them less scary. And if that helps you make interviews less scary, think about it like a game. Think about it like a card game. And you can even literally write these on cards or on a piece of paper or on a little post-it note next to your laptop camera, because you may refer back to this list during the interview. And it helps you organize your thoughts and be very thoughtful and strategic about what you want to have said at the end. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the questions that you might get at the beginning of an interview, as well as some questions that you might encounter in the middle of an interview, as well as some questions that you might get at the end of the interview. But again, we really can't predict that. And so spending time, writing out your answers to 30 to 50 to 100 sample interview questions is probably not a good use of your time as compared to spending that time reflecting on this. The beginning of the interview oftentimes involves an icebreaker question. Something like, tell us about yourself, or please take a minute to walk us through your resume. Notice in that first question that the text in parentheses, and your interest in this position. If they're good at what they do, they'll include that in the way they say the question. Tell us about yourself and your interest in the position. They might not. They might forget to do that, or they might intentionally not say that, but they're definitely listening for you to talk about that in your answer to this question, in your answer to any question, really. Not that you have to talk about it in your responses to all the questions, but you might look for opportunities to do so. And we're going to do that here with the icebreaker in just a minute. These questions are terrible, though, really, especially at the beginning of an interview, because they're so open-ended, and you're going to be so nervous that you might be tempted to try to play all your cards in response to that first question. But you don't want to do that. In fact, you can't do that. So don't even try. So here's a formula for how to answer an icebreaker question. And keeping in mind that these aren't even real questions. They're just ready to get everybody warmed up. Tell them 20 to 30 seconds about something from your past. Something that you did, something that you were, could be where you're from. Tell them 20 to 30 seconds about something that you're doing right now, who you are. And then tell them 20 to 30 seconds about what you hope to do in the future or who you hope to be. And you can see how that is a natural jumping off point to play one of your cards from that stack of things you want them to know that you know about them. And I'm so excited about this particular position because that's going to help you become that person you want to be in the future. And then you have to stop talking. That's the most important part. This is an icebreaker. It's not even a real question. You want to stop talking and get to the real questions. Okay, the middle of the interview is going to be primarily composed of 2 kinds of behavioral questions. And again, you can sometimes tell, you can pick up clues as to what they might ask you about from a close read of the qualifications section of the job that you're applying for. The first type of question is called what I call an explicit behavioral question, not because it's about an explicit behavior, but because the behavior that they're asking you about is named in the question. And a common form of this question is, tell us about a time when you blanked. And again, the words that you might put in that blank are going to come from the qualification section of the job. Another variation on this format where the behavior is named, or the value in this case is named, is something like XYZ is very important to us here at our agency. How have you demonstrated XYZ in your work? So that's the same type of question. They're asking you to tell them a story and show them that this thing is also important to you. That's a values alignment question. They're wanting to see if your values align with their values. So those questions are rather straightforward, but oftentimes there are also implicit behavioral questions. And by that, I mean that the behavior is not named in the question. And that is a situation where you really have to spend some time before you start talking, thinking about what they're looking for in terms of behaviors that are not named in the question. So an example of that would be something like this. What is something that challenges you at work? That's really a weakness question, and we'll talk more about strength and weakness questions here in a minute. But the word weakness is not in there, and that makes it a little bit trickier. And then the last type of implicit behavioral question, which is sometimes also tricky, which we'll talk briefly about, are when they present you with a hypothetical situation in the form of a question during an interview. regardless of the format, regardless of whether the behavior is named or not named, you want to follow a format of telling a good story. And we talked about that STAR format earlier, and you can see in that graph at the top, here is another like uh, a better description of that, where you kind of breaks it down and it walks you through how you would make sure you touch on all four of these points in the context of your answer. Notice again, they say at the bottom in the black box at the bottom of that first graphic, do not think of other new details as you answer. Say what you had planned for and end. Many times when I'm preparing to work with students and they're telling stories, they kind of get to the end of the story and they're nervous about not having answered the question. So they go back and they tell the whole story again. And I call that circling the tower. And they just need to land the airplane. And so just stop talking. And if you're not sure if you answered the question, you can always check in with the interviewer. But I bet you probably answered the question. And I bet you probably had just enough detail. I prefer, when I'm telling stories, to use other methodologies that are very similar but have different acronyms. I like the PAR story methodology in the graph at the bottom because it's about problem solving, and employers have problems and they are looking for people who can solve problems. And I think telling them about a problem that you solved or attempted to solve is a compelling format for a story during an interview or a cover letter for that matter. I also like that Carl format. Challenge, action, result, learning, because I think that challenges like problems are things that are compelling to talk about in an interview. And I like how Carl has that emphasis on learning at the end. What did you learn from that? Could be a skill, could be a value, could be a life lesson. I think oftentimes that format is especially helpful talking about a weakness question, even if the word weakness isn't in the question. Here are about a dozen examples of questions that are about strengths and weaknesses, again, where neither of those words is used. And I say in disguise here, not because employers are trying to trick you, but simply because asking someone directly about a strength or a weakness generally does not yield very useful information. People struggle to talk about their strengths. People also struggle to talk about their weaknesses. So oftentimes they go at that same topic from a different angle. But I think one of the things that really shines through for me about all of these questions here is the importance of talking about learning. So if you were embarrassed in a work situation, or you did make a mistake, or you got some bad feedback, or you experienced a challenge, what did you learn from that? And how are you going to apply that moving forward? That's almost more important than the first part of the story, where you talk about how you failed, or you talk about how you were embarrassed. So that part of the story is not going to make or break your answer. It's really what you took away from it and how it changed you. The last type is, as I said, hypothetical situations. And I'll give you an example of that here. Let's say you're applying for a job with a local health department. It involves community outreach, and they pose to you a question like this. You put together a new community engagement tool, and it doesn't meet expectations. It's kind of a bust. How will you respond? That doesn't have a lot of information. And so there are some challenges in how you answer these questions, but I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that they want to see how you problem solve out loud. So do that. So problem solve out loud in your answer. Show your work like a 7th grade math problem. Write out the long division because that's what they're looking for. However, because you don't have a lot of information, you can't let that get in your way of giving them a quality answer. And one effective technique to get around that lack of info is by using if-then statements. So in this case, I would say something like, well, I would reach out to some of our community partners and I would ask them why they thought that new engagement tool didn't meet expectations. And if they said A, then I would do B. But if they said C, well, then I think I would probably do D. And you can keep going. You can keep problem solving, even if there isn't enough information in the question. That last point, remember the people in the problem, is just, I think, reminder that oftentimes these hypothetical scenarios, it's the people in them aren't real, so it's easy to forget that they're people. Let me give you an example of a question like this. As I said earlier, worked for a while helping people prepare for medical school interviews, and hypothetical scenario questions are very common in medical school interviews. Sometimes they even make you act out your response, which I think for some people would be excruciating. But this particular hypothetical scenario that Washington State University Medical School used a couple of years ago was around, pretending that you're a doctor in a small town in Eastern Washington, and you are at your child's soccer practice on a Wednesday evening when a parent of another kid on your kid's team, who's not a friend of yours, but who's a longtime patient of yours, walks up to you on the sidelines of the soccer practice and asks you to refill a prescription for them tonight at the practice because they're out of this medication and they want to pick some up on the way home. What do you do? How do you respond? And, when practicing this question with students, oftentimes they very quickly determine the correct answer, which is, of course, you do not fill that prescription on the sidelines of your kid's soccer practice. However, that's not the hard part of that question. I think the hard part of that question is, why is this person doing this? Why are they coming up to you and making this kind of strange request in this strange setting? You want to keep the conversation going with that person, and you want to keep the door open to learning more about it, whatever your response is. So that's, I think, a good example of just remembering that that's an actual person, it's an actual patient, and you want to demonstrate empathy to them as you work through these scenario questions. Okay, we're almost done. The second to last question, the penultimate question that you might get towards the end of the interview, might be something like this. Is there anything else you want us to know about you? Or, this is a strange way to ask it, but what is the question that you wish that we would have asked you? And this is an opportunity for you to go back to those lists of 3 to 5 things that you wrote about yourself and 3 to 5 things that you wrote about them. And if you've said all the things about you already in the interview, if you played all of your cards, kudos to you, good job. Here is also an opportunity to tell them something that you didn't say about them that you want them to know that you know about them. Sort of like a closing statement. But you might not get asked this question, which is why you don't want to save things until the end of the interview. You want to have played those cards throughout the interview. You don't want to wait, especially if you're waiting for them to ask you why you want to work there, because they might never ask you that question directly, because they want all of your answers to help them understand why you want to work there. So you might not get that second to last question, but you'll probably get this as your last question. This is sort of a way to bring most interviews to a close. They ask you, what questions do you have for us? And if you haven't had a chance yet to play all of your cards, you have one more chance. You can play a card in the form of a question. It's almost like Jeopardy, where you could say something like, blank is very important to me. How does your organization demonstrate its commitment to blank? An example of a question like that with more specifics is the second one. How do you make sure people in the organization are seen and heard? That is an inclusion question. How do you create inclusive work environments? But of course, the question does not have the word inclusion in it at all. So it's a DEI question in disguise. You could certainly ask about diversity, equity, or inclusion. At this point in the interview, if those things are important to you, you should feel comfortable asking about them, and they should be green lights to employers who are committed to creating inclusive work environments. Anything in that box on the left would certainly be appropriate to talk about, with one exception, the bottom right corner, where they say this is not the time to talk about salary. That'll be in the form of an offer, which comes later. So this is not the time to ask questions of the people you're talking to if they cannot answer them. I like to have a couple of open-ended questions in my pocket, which I ask in almost every interview because I think that they're very helpful. The first is, what are some of the challenges of this position? What's going to be the steepest part of the learning curve? And I think that helps you learn more about them and their organizational culture in terms of what they think is difficult. It also gives you an opportunity to respond to their response, which typically when you ask questions at the end of an interview, you don't have the opportunity to respond to their response. You just move on to your next question. But, I live in Seattle. And so, for example, if when asked this question, what's going to be the hardest thing about working here, they were to say, oh, well, it rains a lot here in the wintertime. And, it's kind of rains all day some days. And you could say in that situation, well, I have a great pair of rain pants and I got a great raincoat and I wear a hat with a brim. And so I'm going to be fine. That's a ridiculous example, but I think you see how it does provide you with an opportunity, if you choose to talk about how that's not going to be challenging for you. The other question that I like to ask about, what does success look like in this role? How will I know in 6 months or a year that I've been successful? And that communicates something very important to the employer about you, which is that you are dedicated to being successful. And that's something that every employer is looking for in every employee. So always have a couple of good questions in your back pocket for the end of the interview. Um, the last question, which you should ask, is sort of like a may I be excused from the table question. And that is, what are the next steps in the hiring process? And this is going to help you get some useful information about whether there's going to be another round of interviews or how many other people they're going to be talking to and when you could hope to hear back from them about whether or not you're going to move forward. And if you're somebody like me who worries a lot after interviews, this can help you kind of schedule your worrying. So, for example, if you interview on a Thursday, and you say, what are the next steps in the hiring process? And they say, oh, well, we're interviewing a couple more candidates tomorrow and then 3 more next week. And we're hoping to have a decision made by next Thursday. And we're going to communicate out to people next Friday. Well, then you don't need to worry about hearing back from them until next Friday. So you're not going to spend the next week refreshing your email because you're not, you're not going to hear anything back. And in the meantime, you can spend your time applying for other jobs. The last thing, of course, is after the interview, I like to wait just a little bit before I send a thank you note because I want to say something thoughtful in the thank you note that I send that is something that I didn't say during the interview or is in response to something that they said during the interview. And so I need a little bit of time to think about that. Now, if they were to tell me in response to my last question, what are the next steps that they're going to be meeting later on today, or they're going to be meeting tomorrow morning to make their decision, then I would obviously send that thank you note sooner rather than later. But I like to take a little bit of time if I have it, so it can be more thoughtful. And I send that thank you note to anybody who I've been corresponding with already. And that's typically like somebody in an HR capacity, and then maybe the person who might be your future boss. But if you don't have their email already, I wouldn't track down their email and send them a thank you note because they might be in a situation where they're not allowed to respond to you or they're discouraged from responding to that. And they just might, I would worry about how that might go over. So I would just email back the people I've been emailing already and thank them again for the opportunity. Okay. That was a lot of content in a short amount of time. So I hope that you're still with me here. And if so, I'm happy to take additional questions about resumes, cover letters, interviews, anything career related, anything that you want to talk about in terms of how to make your experience and your internship work harder for you at helping you find that next thing.
And feel free to put your questions in the chat, the Q&A, or you can always raise your hand and we can allow you to speak. But real quick, as we're kind of waiting down, I wanted to just say I really loved your ideas for the icebreaker
Great.
and kind of that format and the formula. Sometimes it does feel like you want to get a lot of information out right at the
Yeah.
beginning, but kind of
Yeah.
sharing what you need to share and stopping is sometimes it's a
Yeah.
really good advice.
Thank you for circling back to that. And, one other point just on icebreaker while you brought that up, and I see that we do have someone raise their hand, and I want to get to their question in a minute, but that icebreaker question, again, depending on how it's worded, tell us about yourself. It is an opportunity to talk about your personal life if you want to. You don't have to, right? It could everything you say could be about school or your internship or your work experience, but all of the other questions in the interview are going to be about school and your internship and your work experience. Like it's rare to be able to talk about your personal life in an interview, except at that icebreaker. So if there's things you want them to know about you, and that could be hobbies, or again, it could be like where you're from, your family of origin. It's perfectly appropriate to talk about that if you want to, but of course you don't have to. You could keep it all school and work related. Thank you for reminding me about that. Let's go ahead and take that question. Is it Naya or Nia? Did I say that correctly?
Can you hear me?
I think so. Go ahead.
It's Naya, that's correct.
Thank you, Naya.
So, my question was, it was about the one of the last few slides you had about
Yes.
um the interviewer saying to the interviewee something around the lines of right here, yeah, what is there anything else that you want us to know about you?
Yes.
And I have been asked that before, but I wanted to know what in particular are they looking for in that answer? Because there may be times where I'm stumped when I'm just looking forward to answering the question that they have for me, and then I have my specific questions for them, but I don't
Yeah.
know what they want me to say.
This feels like a trick question almost, right? And you
Yeah.
just, and like you said, you just want to get to your questions, but you're worried that if you were to say, I don't have anything, that would not be a good answer. So I think that there's not anything in particular that they're looking for, but I do think it's just a polite way of making sure that, you feel like you've been heard and you've had an opportunity to kind of like be your authentic self. Um, because again, the way that people talk about their experiences in their resume or their cover letter might have missed some level of nuance that they could catch here at the interview stage, but it is really incumbent upon you at that point to to bring that to their attention. So I think a safe answer, if you're in a situation where you don't really have anything else because you've done a good job and you played all your cards and you just want to get to the questions, would be just to say, I just want to reiterate how excited I am about this opportunity. And then maybe tell them one reason why. And you might have already have said it. You could reiterate it again, right? And then just move on. So that's
Yeah.
more of like a placeholder response more than anything else. But if you don't have something else to add, it's not like a missed opportunity. I don't want you to overthink the
Okay.
question.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for asking that.
Great question. All right, we have another one in the Q&A. The question is it appropriate for you to mention publications where you are listed as co-author, but played a minor role in your resume?
So the question is, you played a minor role in the publication, or just that the publication itself plays a minor role in your overall experience? Is that, I guess I'm having a hard time interpreting the question.
Sorry, yeah. So in your resume, is it appropriate for you to mention a publication where you were listed as a co-author, but played a minor role, I'm assuming, in the publication?
In the publication, sure, absolutely. If you're concerned about taking credit for other people's work, then it's a good idea to be very thoughtful about how you describe that you were only a small part of the project, but here's how I contributed. Here's how I contributed in unique ways to the project, whatever your contributions might have been, and trying to focus as much as possible on the work that you did. A lot of it's going to depend really on whether or not the publication itself or the act of making a publication, of writing a publication, is relevant to whatever you're applying to. And if it is, great. And if it's less relevant, well, then you really have to focus more on what it was about the experience of being involved in the writing of a publication that translates to whatever it is that you're applying to, which might be a stretch, which again, maybe is really something incumbent upon you to do for them. But so much of it depends on what you're applying for. I hope that answers the question.
Anybody else have questions? She said yes, that does answer the question. Thank
Great.
you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Anyone want to come off mute or enter into the chat or Q&A? Oh yeah.
Please go ahead, Niall.
Okay, just one more question.
Please.
So I wanted to get your opinion on this question that an interviewer asked me. I
Yes.
personally felt like it wasn't the best. Someone asked me around the words of like, if your supervisor had to rate you from 1 to 10, what would it be? Like 1 is like, I guess not good, and then like 10 is the best. I personally felt like that would come from a supervisor, not from me. So how do you feel about questions like that make me feel like it's not relevant, I guess?
Yes. Thank you for that. I'm going to go back to a slide earlier in my deck because I feel like that question is a weakness question in disguise. Can you see my screen? Oh, sorry, I got a
Yes.
lot going on here. Yeah. So here, let me try to explain why they asked the question that way. Because you're right, it's weird. It's a weird question and it's kind of inappropriate. And you're like, I don't know, why don't you ask him, right? Because they
Right,
also
yeah.
oftentimes ask you for your references before they make you an offer, which is later in the process. I think the reason why they do that, it's almost kind of the corollary of like a teamwork question where they ask you what your teammates would say about you and how you contribute to the team. That's more of a positive framing of the same question. But rather than have you talk about yourself, whether it's a strength of yours or a weakness of yours, because we struggle to do that, what they're trying to get you in the form of this question is almost like a hand puppet. Like, if you were your boss, what would your boss say about you? Because they think that it's easier for you to talk about it in your boss's perspective than it is in your own perspective. But I think, as you just explained, that's not necessarily the case. So I think, again, you might be overthinking the question, and focus on, one thing your boss might think is really good about you and one area where you might need to improve, and then you stop talking.
Okay.
But again, I think those are challenging questions to ask, to answer rather, whether it's about talking about what you're good at or talking about what are still getting better at. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I hope that's helpful.
It did.
Any other final questions here for Dan? And Dan did share his email address, and we will be sending out slides, and we'll have a recording up on YouTube later if you do have any follow-up questions for him. I really quickly wanted to kind of share with you a few things that NEHA is doing for students. Can you all see my screen? Awesome. All right. So we know that in the next few years, about 40% of professionals in the environmental health workforce plan to leave their jobs. So our focus on students here at NEHA is key to building the next generation of a workforce who is trained and prepared to protect communities from emerging environmental health threats. So while NEHA has always had a focus on student development with things like our annual undergraduate and graduate scholarships, which gave out more than $18,000 last year, we've further enhanced our focus and are offering several things. So we're continuing to offer the undergraduate and graduate scholarships for students who attend environmental health accredited programs. We have a student research competition and our NEPHIP internship program. We're also, of course, hosting these career skills webinar series and environmental health grand round webinar series. And in addition, we are offering a free student membership for the next 12 months. So I would really encourage anyone who is interested in environmental health and wants to connect with those who are already in the field and have access to lots of different offers and trainings from NEHA to go ahead and go sign up for the free membership for the next year. I also want to invite you to the next installment of our Student Career Skills webinars series. And that one will focus specifically on strategies for designing and presenting environmental health posters. And that will be on December 3rd. I'm going to place that registration in the chat there. So, if you plan to do a poster for a project that you've done in environmental or public health, work with your studies, we'd love to see you come to that webinar to learn a little bit more about kind of tips and tricks for doing that. And I will also go ahead and put in the chat here the link for the free student membership. Oh, that did not work. Here we go. All right. So once again, I want to thank you all so much for being here today. Dan, thank you so much for presenting. It was a wonderful presentation. I hope everyone got a lot out of this topic. We hope to see everyone in December for our second of the webinar series. And as you exit out today, it will give you a survey link. If you could please take that survey, that'll be really helpful for us to determine what students want to hear about in this webinar series and how we can best support you in your future environmental health careers. So thanks again, Dan. Thank you everyone for asking your questions. And
Thank you, Adrienne, for organizing. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.